Imagine sitting in an audit review 6 months from now and somebody asks a very simple question. How many AI agents are currently running across the company? Who approved them and what can they access? And the honest answer is not great. You've got a few in service desk, a couple in customer ops, someone in finance built one to reconcile invoices. Sales is testing one that drafts account summaries. There's an HR assistant floating around in a collaboration tool. A product team wired one into internal docs. Security has a separate one doing triage. Some of these are real deployments. Some are pilots that never got shut off. Some have service accounts. Some are using personal initiative and good intentions as their control framework. And nobody can produce one clean current answer. That right there is the problem. We already know what this pattern looks like. We saw it with SaaS. We saw it with low-code automation. We saw it with scripts and bots that started as a shortcut and ended up becoming part of the business. Now it's happening again with agents. And that's why agent sprawl is the new shadow IT. So I want to answer 3 questions here. First, what are the signs that useful experimentation is quietly turning into shadow agent growth? Second, what should the organization require before an agent is allowed anywhere near production? And how do you keep the blast radius under control when these things spread faster than your policy model was built for? Because that's really the shift here. The moment an agent can access data, call tools, trigger workflows, or operate with delegated permissions, it stops being a fun experiment and becomes a governance object. That's the mindset change. Now, the reason this catches companies off guard is that nobody wakes up one day and says, let's create an unmanaged population of semi-autonomous systems with uneven ownership and fuzzy access boundaries. That's not how it happens. It starts with one team trying to save time. Then another team sees the idea and builds their own version. Then a platform team enables a new connector, and then somebody gives it access to a shared drive or a ticketing queue or a CRM view or an internal knowledge base. And then a pilot survives long enough to become a dependency. And by the time governance shows up, the conversation is not, should we allow agents? The conversation is, how do we unwind 20 of them without breaking work people now rely on? That's why I'd watch for the signs early, not the dramatic signs, the boring signs. Those are the ones that matter. One sign is duplicate capability. You find 3 different agents doing basically the same thing in 3 different departments, each built in a different platform, each with a slightly different data path, and none of them registered in any common process. Another sign is fuzzy ownership. Ask who owns an agent, and you get 3 different answers. The builder says it belongs to the business. The business says the platform team enabled it. The platform team says that they just provide the tool. Security says they were never asked. That's a classic shadow IT behavior. The technology is new. The organizational failure is not. Another sign is access that expands one practical decision at a time. The agent starts out reading internal docs, then it needed calendar access, then ticket access, and then maybe a workflow action, then maybe a connector into a system of record. None of these steps felt outrageous on their own, but you put them together and now you've got a system acting across boundaries that nobody reviewed as a whole. And the biggest sign of all is simple. When you ask for the inventory, there isn't one, or there are 4. There's a spreadsheet from governance, a list from one platform admin, a few ticket records, and a lot of, we think that's everything. That's not an inventory. That's a scavenger hunt. So here's the control point that I would push hard. No enterprise can govern what it cannot enumerate. Before you get fancy with policy, before you debate advanced AI risk taxonomy, before you build steering committees and review boards, start with a registry. And I want to be clear here because people hear registry and immediately picture bureaucracy in a bad suit. That's not the goal. The goal is a boring, usable, current record of what exists. That can be a table in your GRC platform. It can be tied to your CMDB. It can live in a workflow tool that feeds security and audit reporting. The exact implementation matters less than the discipline behind it. At minimum, every agent in production should have a unique ID, a business purpose, a named business owner, a named technical owner, the platform it runs on, the model or provider behind it, the systems it can touch, the data classification involved, the identity or service account it uses, its approval date, its current environment, and the next review date. That's the minimum, because once you have that, now you can ask real governance questions. Like, do we know why this exists? Do we know who is accountable for it? Do we know what it can access? Do we know whether that access is still justified? Do we know whether this is still a pilot pretending to be production? And this is where ownership becomes a big deal. Ownership is not just a field that you fill in so a form can be submitted. Ownership is an obligation. The business owner is on the hook for the purpose, the value, and whether the agent should still exist. The technical owner is on the hook for implementation, for integration, for logging, change control, and operational health. And no, the AI team is not an owner. Neither is a shared inbox. Neither is the person who happened to build the first version. You want named accountability. Then I'd add attestation. So not complicated, just explicit. At launch, the owner should attest that the use case is valid, the listed systems are accurate, the privileges are scoped, the data involved is understood, and the controls match the risk. And then they should attest again on schedule and again after material change. That last part matters because agent risk does not stay still. This is one of the biggest blind spots I see in these discussions. People treat the approval moment as if it locks the risk in place. It doesn't. An agent approved in March can look very different in June. Maybe it gets a new connector, or maybe somebody, gives it write access where it used to be read only. Maybe it moves from a test database to real customer records. Maybe a team starts trusting it to trigger actions instead of just generating suggestions. Same agent name, very different blast radius. And that word blast radius is really the heart of the security conversation. The danger is not just that an agent exists. The danger is what happens when identity, data access, and action-taking ability combine in ways that nobody intended to review together. A read-only research assistant is one thing. A research assistant that can open tickets is another thing. One that can modify records, message customers, approve transactions, trigger workflows in a production environment. Now we're in a totally different category. That's why privilege creep is such a big deal here. It almost never arrives as one dramatic overgrant. It arrives as a trail of reasonable little decisions. Let's just connect one more source. Let's just give it one more action. Let's just let this team reuse the same setup. Let's just leave the pilot running until the new process is ready. That is how enterprise risk accumulates. So your deployment policy has to meet reality where it is. And here's what that looks like in practice. Use approved deployment channels only. Don't let production agents grow out of unmanaged side paths. Require registration before production use. Separate prototype from production. A sandbox is not a light version of production. It's a different control state. Apply least privilege from the start. Make access narrow, time-bound where possible, and tied to a real business need. Require logging that is actually useful, not just the system ran, but enough visibility to answer what it did, what it accessed, who approved the pattern. For sensitive actions, keep a human in the loop unless there's a very strong reason not to, and create an exception process with an end date, not an exception process that turns into permanent folklore. And now one thing that makes this easier to run in the real world is risk tiering. Not every agent deserves the same level of friction. A low risk internal assistant that summarizes team notes is not the same as an agent interacting with customer records or financial workflows. So tier them. Low risk might be informational only, no sensitive data, no action taking. Medium risk might involve internal business data or limited workflow triggers. High risk means regulated data, privileged systems, external communications, or material business action. Once you do that, governance stops feeling like a blunt instrument and it becomes proportional. And proportional governance is much easier to defend, much easier to adopt, and much harder for teams to dismiss as performative. So now let's talk about the part that, that most programs skip, right? Periodic certification. And this is where you find out whether the paper version of the environment still matches the real one. On a regular cycle, quarterly for higher risk agents is a pretty sensible place to start. The owner should have to confirm a few things, right? Does this agent still have a valid purpose? Is the owner still correct? Are the listed data sources and connected tools still accurate? Have privileges expanded? Have there been any incidents or exceptions or control deviations? And does it belong in its current risk tier? Should it remain in production at all even? That last question is important. Retirement is a control. A lot of organizations are happy to approve new things and weirdly hesitant to turn old things off. That's how stale automations can become permanent infrastructure. Agents will do the same thing unless you make retirement an expected part of lifecycle management. And now for the uncomfortable piece. A lot of you already have unregistered agents in the environment. That does not mean that you failed. It means the technology moved faster than the operating model. Those are not the same statement. But now you need a cleanup path. I'd keep it practical. Run a discovery campaign across business units and platforms. Give teams a short amnesty window to self-report. Register first, rationalize second. For anything with unclear ownership, unclear identity, or unclear access, force a review. And for anything with no accountable owner at all, it should not stay in production just because it happens to be useful. Useful is not a control. So if I had to reduce this whole thing down to one operating policy, it would sound like this. No agent without registration, no production deployment without named ownership, no sensitive access without scoped approval, no persistent deployment without periodic recertification, and no exceptions without an expiry date and a real review path. That is not anti-innovation. Honestly, it's the opposite. Because once people know the rules, once they know how something gets approved, once they know what ownership actually means, once they know the difference between a prototype and a production capability, now the business can move without pretending the control questions will sort themselves out later, because they won't. They never do. That's the lesson from shadow IT. And that's why agent sprawl deserves governance now, not after the first ugly audit meeting, not after a quiet privilege issue turns into an incident, and not after half the company is relying on systems that nobody can fully account for. The point is not to stop teams from building. The point is to stop the organization from sleepwalking into a new category of unmanaged operational risk.